or even code, as long as you're explicit about what you mean by it. And it doesn't mean what it means in general. It's not a code or a signal under all circumstances. It's a code or signal under these very narrow kind of circumstances that now you're couching in terms of evolutionary biology, which I would agree with. So you can say that the cell is signaling, that transcription is acting as a signal between the genes and the phenotype, basically. But you're very explicit about what signal means in that case, and it's not a signal in any sense. It's only a signal in this narrow sense.
Let me break in real quick just to let you guys know we are live now. Cool. You are catching the I believe we started mid-sentence with Dr. Mace, just to go over briefly what this is about for those of you who are maybe just stumbling upon this. We had a discussion on wrongly named in the title, admittingly. It was not, is DNA a code? It should have said, is the genetic code a code? That was my fault. I will fix that though. Just to let you guys know, let's take a look at the Twitter poll real quick. Right now we are sitting at 53% with Steve and 47% with John. So neck and neck. And about 5 minutes ago, it was the reverse. So it's a tight back and forth between the two of you. Thank you guys for voting, by the way. You can check that poll out on Twitter. And I'll just run through and say hello to everybody so everybody knows who's here. Shannon, you are here. I've seen you. Hello, Shannon.
I'm here. I'm present.
As always, Steve is here. John Perry, stated casually and clearly, is here. Dr. Herman Mays. Hello, Dr. Mays. Long time no see.
Present.
Herman.
0132 321321. Hello, sir. And who do we have here on the end? Christopher. Didn't recognize the avatar. Welcome.
Hello.
So I'm going to let John pick up where Dr. Mays just left off. I just want to say a quick hello, welcome you to the stream, and we'll let the dialogue continue. John.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, yes, I think the reason I'm so passionate about making it very clear that the genetic code really is a code is because of my research, working with researchers in the origin of life. There's a couple of models for the origin of the genetic code. Like, why is it that the ribosome, it's really the ribosome and the tRNA together that determine what the actual rules are for the genetic code. But there's a couple of different models that people are studying for its origin. One is the RNA world hypothesis, which is this hypothesis that the first evolving entities, the first things that could reproduce and evolve were chains of RNA. And the ribosome is really interesting in this case because all of the enzymatic activities that the ribosome does are actually RNA based. There's no protein enzymatic activity. There is actually a little bit now in proteins will help to straighten out a messenger RNA. If a messenger RNA is bound up to itself, there's some proteins in the ribosome that will, some protein parts of the ribosome that will straighten that out. But most of the catalytic activity in the ribosome, like that actually attaches the amino acids to each other, that's all done through ribozymes, so enzymes that are made out of RNA. And so one of the ideas for the origin of the genetic code, the origin of this communication system, is that you have a bunch of different chains of RNA that came together in symbiosis to start building proteins. And we don't really have it worked out as to how did this get started. When you look at the ribosome, there's ways to tell which parts are older than other parts, or we think we can tell. And the chunk of the ribosome that actually will take two amino acids and stitch them together into a peptide, that is the oldest part. So there's a bunch of different models that people have, like, well, maybe amino acids were toxic to these things. And so it was trying to grab them out of its environment, stick them together into clumps to reduce toxicity, for example. And other chains of RNA started cooperating with that until you have this, eventually you have this really complicated system that we now call a genetic code. But the genetic code seems to be optimized so that there's no misreading of the messenger RNA. And that suggests that there were originally multiple genetic codes, and one of them won out. Because all the organisms that use the genetic code today, there are slight variations, but they're very slight variations. So we believe that one ancestor had pretty much close to the modern genetic code locked down, and that gave rise to all of life on Earth, emerging from this RNA world.
So, but why is it that that idea requires you to say that biology in this sense is a literal code in the same sense that we discuss codes in other areas like telecommunications, for instance? What is it about that origin of life idea that requires you to use code in that context? I don't get it.
Because it's the set of rules governing the communication system. It's that set of rules that people want to understand. Why did that set of rules evolve? Why was that the thing that was so beneficial? That's a big question in the origin.
John, can you just call this set of rules an evolved set of rules that is code-like in almost all senses, except in the sense of intentionality and directionality, or purposefulness?
Code, in the sense that it's used by Shannon, like in information theory, doesn't require intentionality. It's actually the same exact like mathematics that are applied when talking about black hole entropy, as in describing like just communication. Basically, any amount of information can be embedded in some other medium.
Sure, but
and then we can describe it that way. Like black holes don't have intentionality, but we still say that the event horizon contains information.
And I get it, and I acknowledge that there's lots of things in nature that are code-like and follow almost. You could model them according to all these rules of information theory and Shannon information, etc. But they don't have intentionality, right? Telecommunications does have intentionality, and it involves Shannon information as well. So I'm just emphasizing that when you talk about it as a code, you emphasize this point that it doesn't involve any agency or intentionality. And I don't think anybody disagrees with that, do we?
Intent as in a mental intent with a brain, no. But
I don't know how else you use the word intent.
Well, I mean, if you want to be more broad, you could say that, would you say that a bacteria intends to survive?
No, they don't intend to survive.
It just behaves as though it intends to survive.
No, they have evolved characteristics that are favored by natural selection. And that means by definition that those characteristics have a relative survival advantage. That's it. There's no intentionality in that at all.
If a bacteria is communicating to another bacteria, and we can find that set of rules that they're using to communicate, you don't want to call that code because it doesn't have a brain.
That set of rules are chemical interactions that evolved, and they evolved relative to other chemical interactions, and that particular set gave them a survival advantage relative to others. So it spread in the population. Again, there's no intent involved in any of it.
So a bacteria can never intend to send out a signal because it doesn't have a brain, is what you're saying?
No, it can't. It can send out signals under certain environmental conditions because it has evolved the capacity to do that. But there's no intent involved in it.
All right, rather than starting, we don't want to have another definition argument.
Huh?
Sorry. We don't want to have another definition argument, so I'm just going to say I agree with Maze's version of intent. It requires, like, thought. It's actually willful intent. It's not just, like, something appearing to strive towards a goal. can we work with that, or is that a problem?
Yeah, and it has to be that way. And one thing that's confusing about how we use language is humans didn't evolve language to talk about things like quarks or evolution or black holes. So we use the language that we have. We're stuck with it. And the problem with that sometimes is we use language that has evolved to mean one thing, and we use it to describe another context that has nothing to do with what that word evolved to mean. And it can be very confusing for a lot of people. And I think we should be, especially as science communicators, we should be very cognizant of that confusion. And it's very difficult to do because it's extremely difficult to talk about the world around you in language that's void of intent, because our language is just designed, I don't want to say it's evolved to discuss phenomena in terms of intent and purpose. And we're using that language to talk about things that have no intent and no purpose.
Can I ask a question, Dr. Mays? And it's the same sort of question that I asked Steve, I think. And hi, nice to meet you in person.
Yeah.
Okay, so there seems to be a lot of sticking, and I don't necessarily fall on either side, but as a layperson, this is confusing to me. I'm not a biologist, right? Psychology is my field. So when you say, where everybody seems pretty staunch on don't call it a code, don't call it a code, don't call it a code, but there's clearly information transmission and transcription to my mind. So there's something transmitting a message, intentionally or not. That message is being transcribed and consistently transcribed to an output that you can predict. Now, to me, that seems code-esque, right? Based on our definition. But what would you describe it as then? Everybody seems very staunch on, well, you can't call it a code, but what can you call it then?
I think that's the problem that I'm trying to highlight here.
There's no word for it?
Yes, exactly.
The word does not exist.
We don't have a word that describes it adequately. So we have to, if we use other words to describe what's going on, we have to be careful about how we use them, and we have to sort of divorce them from the sort of either colloquial or meanings they picked up in other fields and things like that. So,
but couldn't that word not evolve to encompass this as well?
No. I mean, think about the words we have for lots of things in science. So an example I think I gave earlier in things like this is like electrons. We say electrons have a negative charge. Well, what does it mean to have a negative charge? Why is it literally negative? What does it mean to say it's literally negative? It means nothing. It's just there's two different charges, and we had to call them something. So we called one positive and one negative. It doesn't mean it's literally something negative about it in a sort of bad sense. Like the positive charge isn't a good charge and the negative charge isn't a bad charge. They're just opposite charges. We could have used any number of different words for that, but we just happen to use those words. And they don't mean literally what we're using them for. We don't have words for what positive and negative really are. We don't have words for that.
But would you not continue to refer to it as a negative charge then because of that? Would you insist on somebody using a different word or not using any word at all?
I would keep using those terms because we're stuck with them. You really don't have any choice.
But code's not okay?
No, code is okay. But we have to be clear about what aspects of the genetic code aren't code-like in the same sense that we use code in, say, telecommunications. So we can use the term code when we're talking about sending encrypted messages over a telecommunications channel. Right. Well, there are differences between code in that sense and code in the genetic code, but we're using the exact same word. My point is you can use the same words, but you just have to be very clear about the same words can have different contexts. Right?
But you're saying that the only difference between the nucleus talking to the ribosome is that it doesn't intend to do so. It's doing it automatically. That's the only difference between me talking to you.
I'm not necessarily saying that's the only difference, but that is a huge difference. It's the difference that leads people to be confused about what's going on. It leads people to not recognize evolution as an emergent process, but they start to think about it as an intentional or direct process. And that distinction, people have studied this a lot in science, about how a lot of misconceptions in science stem from our inability to distinguish between direct processes and emergent processes. And often that inability to distinguish between those two types of processes stems from the language that we use. So it is, I mean, maybe it is the only difference, but if it's the only difference, it's a huge difference that's consequential in terms of science communication.
So couldn't you just say that the code is an evolved code versus an invented code?
Once you start saying it's an evolved code, now you start to separate out that term from the way the term is used in telecommunications, which is sort of how people are going to naturally think of a code, right, in a colloquial sense. So you have to do things like that to separate out what you mean when you say a genetic code versus a code in a telegraph encryption, secret code kind of thing.
So the utilization of the word is okay, so long as you stipulate the context in which you're using it, and make sure that the people that you're communicating with, or the audience that you're communicating with, understands how important that differentiation is, and that you can't choose another word because one doesn't necessarily exist.
Exactly. That's right.
And that you're using it essentially as a placeholder, so long as you add on those stipulations. I'm a communications person, right? So being able to transmit messages effectively is my thing. So when you tell me that there isn't a word for something, there must be a way to communicate it. So would you agree that that's the effective way to do this? So they kind of both would be right. Like Steve's on your side in the there's stipulations to be added, and without the stipulations, you can't use it. And John's correct in saying that really this is the only word we can use by definition based on our colloquial and best understanding. So
I don't think that's an unfair assessment of where I'm at.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it.
And again, this is the problem, because we as human beings have, just in the past, say, a couple hundred years, have started to explore some pretty complicated things that are way outside of our everyday experience. And we just do not have the language to describe those things. I mean, think about, like, in quantum mechanics, the terms we use. Quantum mechanics is so outside of our everyday experience that there's really no words that we can have to describe most of it. We talk about things like, you start talking about subatomic particles like quarks, they get names like up and down. And we talk about them having flavors and things like that, because we run out of words to describe the
spin
diversity of the spin. Yeah,
spin's inaccurate, but we use it.
Yeah, we use it. Yeah. So
also the people naming it were probably using some illicit substances at the time.
True.
Up, down, strange, charm, beauty, truth.
Yeah.
So is the fear in adopting the term the fear that people are going to have an inadequate or inaccurate conflation between their colloquial definition of what a code is based on telecommunications? Exactly.
And it's not just, I know John talked about, well, we shouldn't be sort of slaves to how creationists will misinterpret this. This has nothing to do with creationists. I'm talking about just the general public. Even if someone accepts evolution and you're trying to teach them about it, mm-hmm. the language that you use can either hinder their understanding of it or help their understanding of it. And you have to be very careful how you do that. And I'm the worst at some of this stuff. So I teach all the time. And what you find when you teach a lot is you can't help but do things. Like John said today, he said in the debate, he said something about DNA tells the cell to do this. That's the kind of language that I would use all the time. And I'm getting better at catching myself at it. But but you can't help it. You just can't help it. But the truth is that sometimes I'll say, okay, I'll tell the class, okay, DNA is telling the cell to do this. And they'll say, oh, well, of course you all know that really DNA is not telling anybody anything. It's doing this. And that's how I'm just describing it. It's just kind of a metaphor.
So it's sort of a zeitgeist issue.
Sort of. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I
Well,
understand.
That's not necessarily something new. I mean, you mentioned yourself, like quantum mechanics, they use certain terms, but like even older than that, in mathematics, we talk about imaginary numbers, but
Yeah.
they're useful for talking about very real things. Like if you want to talk about periodicity, um, you can basically use relationships to exponentiation there. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's a good example because an imaginary number, the word imaginary is, it means like it's not real somehow. But imaginary numbers are things we just don't encounter in your everyday kind of life of balancing your checkbook or figuring out how many apples you have on the kitchen counter and things like that. But you have to have a word to describe it. It's still a real mathematical entity, but we don't have a word to describe it. So we use words like that. And I think this interplay between language and science is one of the most underappreciated things in science communication that we have.
And we're kind of stuck with the terminology from history, right? I mean, there's some precedent for things, and we kind of build on those things. Like, for example, I think you mentioned earlier about the whole negative and positive thing. We know now that there is no electrons going through a wire, but we're stuck with that. We're stuck with that terminology of electron flow for current, and that's not what it is.
Right. And we've talked about electricity as the flow of electricity forever. And people have connotations of flow when they think of like water, like a flow of a stream. Those two things are totally different. So when you use flow in a stream context and you use flow in electricity context, someone is using the exact same word to describe two really different things going on that only have a kind of superficial resemblance to one another. And that's why we use the same term. So that's really at the heart of the problem. Big Bang is another one, as you know. Like, I think you brought this up, Steve, in the debate, is that term was coined and, physicists instantly hated it, but it stuck. There was no bang to the origin of the universe at all. It's a terrible term too, but you're kind of stuck with at least dealing with it to some degree. You have to mention it.
But so in biology, though, we have all of these communication systems, and they are evolved. And in signaling theory, we learn how those evolve. You have two evolving entities. Selection is favoring their cooperation, and a communication system inevitably evolves. And we can study that communication system. We can study the rules of that communication system. We can write out those rules. We can map that out perfectly.
I don't think anybody's denying that. I've never denied that happens.
If we discuss it as a code, then aren't we able to use tools that we've applied to, like basically that we've developed for information processing, to meaningfully talk about biological concepts in a useful way? Or is that not?
Sure, I think so. I think we can, but we can use a lot of the concepts from information theory that might have been derived in an entirely different context to talk about things in biology. That's fine. But just like the flow, talking about the flow of a stream isn't like the flow of electricity. We also have to recognize that there's differences.
Yeah, but the flow of information in a telecommunication system is the same as the flow of information in a genetic system. The only difference is that there's not a brain behind it. It's two evolved entities versus two thinking entities. That's the only difference.
Is the flow of information in a telecommunications network and the flow of information in gene expression and the flow of water in a stream and the flow of electricity all the same thing? Is flow mean the same thing in all those contexts?
Well, in a communication system, you have two entities.
I mean those four contexts: gene expression, a stream, a telecommunications network, and electricity. Does flow mean exactly the same thing in all four contexts?
Physically, there's lots of differences in how it works, but
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you do have something in one area going to another area.
Actually, not necessarily.
Yeah, electronic, like the flow of electricity. Yeah. Usually, it's not things aren't really
moving. Yeah, it's not the same thing in that context at all. But we still use the word flow.
Because it's a linguistic limitation.
Yeah, and it has some of the macro properties of flow that make it appear flow-like. So it makes sense to use the word flow, but it's it's not the same thing.
But that makes it difficult though, because it's adequate in all of those contexts to use the word flow.
It's adequate.
It's adequate. It's adequate. And we don't have anything else that's interchangeable and more adequate necessarily.
It can be adequate.
Right?
However, it can be adequate. However, it doesn't, unless you understand this sort of nuances, then you're never going to really fully understand the phenomenon. Right.
So it's adequate with caveats. It's adequate with caveats.
I don't know if it's even adequate. Because I don't think it's even adequate, because if you're talking about fluid theory, right, there's a lot of things that go into fluid theory as far as like having boundary conditions, laminar flow, turbulent flow, Reynolds number, a lot of things that you have to deal with when dealing with net positive suction head. I mean, there's 1,000 things that go into fluid mechanics. None of that applies in electronics because nothing's really flowing. It's just a hole that's actually moving.
Okay. So Steve, listen to me though, from a communications perspective. Sure. I don't understand a lot of the basic theories behind most of the things that you just attempted to transmit to me. Were any of the words you used in those sentences adequate to transmit that in? To transmit there seems to be a semantic argument based on the quality of the information to be transmitted. The quality of the information being transmitted needs to be that in which somebody receiving the information will understand it explicitly, like in full and in all contexts. So that's where it becomes difficult to me, because if something isn't adequate to transmit that information so that a layperson can at least get the gist of understanding it, and we're all arguing semantics
can I
about
ask a
it.
question? I'm curious if I can. So, like, there seems to be two things happening with this, and I agree with where you're coming from, Shannon. Like, it's a communications issue, but like if we look at, say, music is a combination of frequencies of sound arranged in a certain way, but we wouldn't say all combinations of frequencies of sound is music, right? We have a specific word to describe that, but we don't have like the specific word to describe the sort of emergent property that appears as a structured system that we've labeled. That's an emergent property of our understanding of observing how things work when you're looking at like DNA in this. But just saying that it's genetic code should be enough to hyphenate it and say this has a specific thing, because the communication happens when somebody learns what you mean by that, right? So like if somebody says, what is DNA? It's not inherent, right? You have to give a description in the same way that, you can have a car and you can have a toy car. Those are very, very different things. And you can define them when you're learning what that language means, like through the education process or what have you. So I don't see why it's a problem to say that DNA is a code or there is a genetic code, and to define that and teach that through the learning process.
I think, to answer what Shannon was talking about, I think you can use the terminology to give the layperson a general understanding of the phenomenon. And I think if you use the word code in that context, then someone is probably going to get I don't think they're going to bat an eye about it. I mean, they're going to get it if you explain it to them. However, once you start trying to understand these things very deeply, you start to realize that the words we use every day for a lot of for natural phenomenon are inadequate. And knowing why they're inadequate is very important to understanding the phenomenon itself.
Okay.
Can I cut in?
Aren't words, generally speaking, on their own inadequate? Like, you need a greater context. Like,
right. And
if I say that words are a vehicle for communication, we understand in the context of that sentence that the word vehicle in the sentence isn't something that you can get in and drive around, right? Like,
yes,
it's because of the overall context. So, I mean, I see why you should like point at any one specific word and say it's inadequate, because it requires a greater context through your communication.
I think the difference, David, in that context is no one would confuse that statement for saying there's a literal vehicle.
Look, can I cut in here, please?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing is, you're talking about these words being adequate for a lay audience, and the issue is that none of them are adequate for a lay audience, because ultimately the way that these words are introduced in the literature is that there'll be a really long paragraph describing the thing in detail, and then there'll be a sentence that says, or a clause that says, which we will henceforth refer to as, right?
Right.
So, which we will henceforth refer to as flow or code or whatever else. And so these terms then, they get used and the lay audience can hear them, and maybe they'll get a 30% idea of what's going on. And they don't really care because they're a lay audience, and they'll get 30% of the picture, but they'll end up filling in the rest of the 70%. And that 70% they fill in could be way off.
I agree with that.
And
Okay.
Makes sense to me, actually.
Yeah.
That's fair. Okay, so the issue is, as a science communicator, how do you best communicate this? Because I understand that you guys understand it more fully than me, right? So that's fine. So it seems like a qualitative receiver issue. So you can understand how it could be adequate in that context. Now, if it's adequate in that context to transmit, I guess, a high level receiver output, to speak in communication terms, then the question falls to you. Nobody seems, if you're all arguing about how this isn't the best way to communicate with somebody who isn't an expert in this field, the question falls to you, what is the best way? And thus far, the only answer I've heard is to say it is a code with stipulations and caveats that need to be placed in context.
Exactly.
So John did a presentation with some stipulations and caveats that I thought kind of put it in context, at least to me. So how did that not take place?
Well, I read John's presentation as having a lot of sort of intentional subtext to it, if not overt, that maybe he didn't intend. But me, that I have an ear for this stuff that maybe is more sensitive than the average person. So I tend to, like I said, I catch myself doing it all the time. So I'm always listening to myself and trying to catch myself in that sort of language of intentionality.
So what do you think was transmitted to somebody like me in that presentation that would have given me an inadequate understanding of the concept?
I think there is maybe this idea that the protein is a goal.
That the protein is the goal, so that there's
a goal, an end goal of the process.
And would you say there is no goal?
I don't think
and there is no. So I think Shannon, you're maybe more sophisticated than you think you are on this. So maybe that's why. That's maybe why you didn't pick up on this. But I know from listening to him and dealing with lots and lots of very naive undergraduate students, how they interpret things. And I guarantee you that I know a lot of people who would listen to that and sort of view that as there's this goal of the protein at the end of this process.
Okay,
but
so yeah, I was just gonna say, let John speak to that, because I think
here's the problem with this. You talk about emergent properties. I would say that a goal is an emergent property. Like, you have something that evolves and is under selection for survival and reproduction. At some point, it does make sense to say its goal is to survive and reproduce.
No, it doesn't.
Goal requires intent.
Yeah, that's what I go back to intentionality.
And if you wanted an example, Shannon, of what I was hearing throughout, it was just that, just what he said.
And that's the biggest point I was trying
to. That was the problem.
No, and intentionality requires a mental state.
If you want to think about it, this is the key thing that a lot of people who know, they might know a lot about evolution and they accept it. So we're not just talking about naive creationists. A lot of people don't understand the difference between an emergent process and a direct process. So for instance, if you talk about something like diffusion is an emergent process. So you might drop a drop of ink in a big beaker of water, and you'll see that ink move out from that original drop point, and it will diffuse out into the beaker until the beaker is sort of uniform gray, say, right? Everybody knows that process. That is an emergent process. It's not a process that ends. It is based on individual reactions between atoms or molecules inside the beaker that are constantly engaging in this process of just moving around and bumping into one another. It looks like, from the perspective, the macro perspective that we're watching it from, that the drop starts at one place and the drop moves and then it stops once it's all diffused throughout the beaker. The molecules of ink are still moving around the beaker, just the same as they did before. The molecules of water are moving around. Here's my property that has no goal. Its goal is not to disperse throughout the beaker. It's just something that happens because molecules bump around inside a space.
Okay, here's my question then with your definition of a goal then. Do you think that you have goals?
Sure.
Okay. Where do those come from? Aren't they just emergent properties of your brain that evolved?
Yeah, but intentionality is an emergent property of the brain. Goals are our goals, at least, are a result.
I would say the capacity for intentionality is something that evolved, and evolution is an emergent process. That is just a fact. It's not a goal-orientated process. Now, that capacity for intention evolved in some organisms, not all, and that allows us the ability to behave in ways that are directional. But the capacity for that is something that evolved. It wasn't evolution's goal to make us, directional thinking, planning, intentional organisms. Evolution had no goal. I can have a goal, but evolution doesn't have a goal.
Okay, but earlier you said that intention is a state of mind, and now you're saying that a goal is also a state of mind.
No, I never said a state of mind, not once.
So let me ask a question, because I'm trying to understand how you're defining where the line for intentionality with these emergent properties are. Would you consider language an emergent property?
Yeah.
Okay. Of structured and social systems.
Think about. There's very few languages. There's very few languages that people speak that are the only language that I know of. There might be another one, but the only spoken language that I know of that was planned is Esperanto.
Yeah.
That's a planned.
Klingon.
Huh?
Yeah, Klingon. Yeah.
Klingon.
Klingon, you got a point.
No, except that there have actually been people who were raised.
In Lord of the Rings too is a planned.
There were people raised with that as their primary language, though, Esperanto. Not nobody that I know of grew up speaking Klingon as their primary language.
Right. Most
and natural language. Yeah.
That's because you didn't go through the Croc McGav.
No. What I'm kind of hearing.
Real languages are emergent. They're not planned or directed or intended. Yeah.
So, but it seems to me that through language, we ascribe sometimes non-existent things. Like numbers don't exist. We've created those to describe quantities of things, or for lack of a better term, like numbers, code, all that stuff. Those are created emergent processes, and so are the models that we create to describe the things that we observe. So if you're doing archery and your goal is to hit the target, so you fire the arrow doesn't have the goal of hitting the target, but we ascribe that the goal of the arrow in that context is to hit the target because we've directed it.
No,
right?
We have the goal. The arrow doesn't have the goal.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I mean. But
the archer has the goal.
Yeah.
Now, when we're looking at DNA, especially if you're looking at manipulating it or gene editing and all this sort of thing, at that point, we are taking the information that's there and we're using it as a code. So when people are saying DNA is a code, they're talking about an understanding of the entire structure, the entire model, not just the physical thing that we're observing. We're talking about a larger concept, it seems.
Yeah.
Right. So it's the concept that's sort of the wrapping paper around the thing. And I don't think that it would be incorrect to call that wrapping paper the code, in the sense that that is an emergent property of our understanding of what we're observing.
And again, like I said before, I don't think it would necessarily be incorrect as long as you're explicit as to your definition of code and distinguish that code from other types of code that differ. So it's not the code in the sense of a telecommunications code.
So where does the responsibility lie in how complex that we need to use this when we're using it as a shorthand, right? Like you're not going to, have a paragraph explanation as to what this is every time you want to say that DNA is a code when you're referring to that kind of concept surrounding it.
Well,
it's
I'll say
clearly
this.
important to be able to explain it.
Yeah, I don't have all the answers to this, so I'll be up clear about that. I'll say this, though. How scientists will talk to each other about things, we kind of get the subtext. So if I'm talking to another scientist and I'm talking about, well, DNA tells the cell to do this, another scientist isn't going to confuse that. But it depends on the audience. If I'm using that to a very naive audience, that might, in their mind, start to foster some concept of intentionality or directionality in evolution that isn't there. So
why wouldn't it be appropriate to say, hey, you understand what code is? Here's the difference. Like, here's genetic code.
Can I get a different example of something similar where we use these types of terminologies to imply intentionality that's not really there? But if we say something like, like my computer's trying to reboot, right? It's not actually trying to do anything, right? There's no intentional state there. That's a limitation we have in the language. So I think what John's doing is very similar to that. He's just saying that there's an intent for the DNA to make the protein when that's not how it works. Same thing with the computer, though. Again, it doesn't try to do anything. There's no intentionality there.
But when you say that, Steve, I understand what you mean.
You do.
I understand. Yeah. Well, if you say your computer's trying to reboot, I don't think that anybody thinks that your computer has sentience.
But I think John's making the same mistake, though. I think he's making that same exact.
So it's an over attribution.
It's a mistake to say your computer's trying to reboot. Like, I understand that conceptually that's wrong if you're putting intention there, but I don't think most people.
No, you
think
misunderstand
there's like a little gnome running around in there trying to figure things out.
But I think you're misunderstanding me. He's attributing intentionality to a system that is not dealing with mental states. Now we use language.
He's not attributing it, right?
David, let me finish. We use language loosely, right? So when I say something like the computer's trying to reboot, everybody understands that, right? It's technically not correct, but we all understand what it means by that because there's no intentionality there. When we're talking about the DNA and code, this is the problem. He's applying intentionality there that doesn't exist. And he's saying it literally is a code with intentionality to do this. He is called ribosomes agents. He says this has agency, right? A ribosome cannot be an agent. There's no agency there.
I don't think that's necessary. I think that you're gleaning that, but somebody like me wouldn't glean that. Well, apparently we're not going to use somebody like me, but I think that you might be gleaning that when we've already kind of agreed that most standard definitions of a code fits the standard definitions of a code. There is no other word to use for that. Okay, is that fucking Jesus? Fine. Use cipher then if you want to, Steve. But like, if just because you feel as though that seems like a synonym to me, or some sort of semantics to me. But I feel that everybody's giving John this attribution that he is meaning to imply that these chemical processes have some sort of sentient intention.
No, I don't say.
When he's not.
Nobody's saying that.
Really saying that.
Yeah, I'm not saying that either by any means.
But that's what it seems like. It seems like that's the point of contention is that everybody's saying, well, he's implying intentionality, and that's the issue.
John, do you think a ribosome is an agent?
It's got degrees of freedom across generations.
There you go.
Yeah, that's the problem.
What's that? I don't see the connection between being an agent and degrees of freedom.
Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah.
An agent has aims, goals, desires, has intentionality.
Exactly.
Ribosomes don't have intentionality, right?
What's the simplest? It's an evolving entity that performs a function. I mean, it performs a very specific function, and that is to build a protein when given the right materials in its surroundings.
What's that to do with intentionality?
What I'm curious here is how simple of a thing can you get that has intention? So you're saying that the word intention is for something that has a brain. Like, how simple of a brain does a fly
It's not
intend
that.
to do
It's
something?
not as simple as having a brain, because that's just another piece in the natural world. The issue is that in order to be an agent, you have intentionality, you have aims, goals, or desires, not merely having a brain, because something can just have what would look exactly like a brain but lack aims, goals, or desires.
So you're not defining aims, goals, and desires outside of. So it doesn't need a brain for aims, goals, and desires. So how do you know something has aims, goals, and desires?
Well, there's different ways we can identify what an agent is, and those ways don't track the behavior that we see in ribosomes or other natural entities around the world. So I wouldn't consider ribosomes or other natural entities around the world agents.
Does somebody in a coma have aims, goals, and desires?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Okay, so they still have a brain. Their body's still doing what it can to keep itself alive. Right?
I would actually say maybe otherwise. I mean, they have potentiality too. And I think that's kind of the key. Whether they're in a state where they have aims, goals, no, they're unconscious, but they have the potentiality to do so. And ribosomes don't have any potentiality to even make actuality out of it.
The important thing to distinguish here is that it's not just that it has a brain, so it can have intentionality. It's that intentionality is talking about what aims, beliefs, goals, desires that an agent may or may not have.
Yeah, I think agent
you're considering intentionality an emergent process.
What's that?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Emergent property.
I'm
Well,
not
some
sure what
people
you mean
talk
by
about consciousness as an emergent property. So
right.
Yeah.
I mean,
So, like,
there's confusion. There's not confusion. There's concerns over the link between consciousness and the physical. And that's an interesting topic, but I just want to make clear the idea that intentionality shouldn't be conflated with entities or organelles like a ribosome, for example, performing different functions within a cell, or the language that we use to describe a ribosome performing a different function in a cell.
Let me make this point as well. If you're going to say that a ribosome has intent, then either you're trying to bring in something supernatural, right? Or you're assuming some kind of crazy thing that cannot be brought into evidence, because intent requires awareness.
yeah,
I don't know if that's exactly so.
There's no way to have awareness with something that simple as a ribosome.
I agree.
When you look at the properties of particles and things, and you start getting terms like affinity and trust, trust is sort of an emotional thing in normal context. But if you're talking about particles and you start saying, they have these things like affinity and trust and things, even I think the layperson isn't going to think those particles built up a really good long-term relationship and now they trust each other. They know something else is going on in that context. They may not understand it, which is why we learn, why we need more information. I would think that the layperson, when you start talking about the code of DNA, would say there's something else going on. They're not going to instantly think of it in this computer code sort of way automatically.
Well, you might think that, but
It's about explanation because it's science, right? We're trying to explain things. Our actions and the actions of other agents, the only way we can explain them, or the best way to explain them, is by appealing to their intentions. But you don't need to appeal to any intentions whatsoever to explain the actions of a ribosome, to explain the actions of lightning hitting a tree.
Yes,
to explain the actions of a protein synthesis. There's no intention to appeal to in order to explain such
intention
activity.
Do it to explain, but I mean, if you do choose to do it to explain as a vehicle,
well, that's what you're doing in science, right? You're trying to explain things, right?
Well, exactly. So why would it be incorrect to use that sort of language if that combination of language conveys the concept to
Because
people?
it's not
no, you're conflating two issues, whether or not there's some sort of like a way you can explain what's happening, and be careful with the type of language that you use, because it might lead people to confusing intentionality with like causal activity. And then there's just distinguishing between explanations that appeal to intentions and explanations that don't have to appeal to intentions.
right.
When
And
we
I
want
would
to
say,
explain agent activity, we have to appeal to intentions, but we don't have to appeal to intentions when we want to just explain facts about the world,
to
like
explain,
protein.
to explain translation, you don't have to invoke intentional explanations. They aren't necessary.
You know,
did I invoke intention?
So,
like, I guess what I'm saying is
Yeah, John,
when you say people, pardon me, when you say people have goals, we think about that in a very specific way, right? Like what a goal is for a person. If you put a marble on a track and it's going to zoom around a whole bunch of different things and knock things over and the whole bit, you build one of those crazy wacky machines, right? And the goal is at a certain point to get the marble there, right? And you're talking to people about it. You would very easily colloquially say the marble's goal is to get to here, but that's not necessarily going to make people assume that the marble now has intention. Just because
but actually, in exactly that example, no, I'm sorry. In exactly that example, even though the marble doesn't have a goal, the machine that you've built has a goal, and it's going to make people think, well, the marble doesn't have a goal. Cool, this machine that you built has a goal, right? There's a goal there, right? And so that's the problem with this language, is that when you use it, even if it doesn't make it sound like the individual molecule has a goal, it makes it seem like the system itself does.
Exactly. So if the moment that we start doing things like gene editing, right, where we're modifying for a different outcome, are we not now utilizing that as a machine with a goal, essentially?
Yeah.
So at that
point, okay. Holy smokes, everybody! Wow, holy smokes! All right, so
sorry.
So we can no longer use. When we are describing the genetic code, we've established that we cannot use the word intent, we cannot use the word goal, and we cannot use the word code.
Or agent.
Or agent. Okay, so you can't use intent, goal, code, or agent to describe the genetic code. Everybody take a turn and describe it without using those 4 words.
Oh, I can do that.
Go ahead, Herman, please, because I think that's the point of this. Describe it adequately so that an idiot like me can understand.
So these
without using those 4 trigger words that we've all been debating the semantics of, because holy motherfuck.
These are biochemical reactions that have evolved, and evolution is an emergent process. So they've evolved over time. They've evolved because when they're in competition in the population with other biochemical processes, those particular biochemical processes had a higher relative fitness. And so they spread at the expense of other biochemical processes that had a lower fitness.
Does that explain to me how the genetic code works? Or whatever, the genetic.
You what any biochemical system in the cell is. It doesn't matter if it's translation or cell signaling or anything, replication, whatever. That general explanation you could apply to absolutely anything that goes on in the cell.
So if you had to explain to me how RNA.
I never used agency. I never alluded to any goals or intents. I just described it as a biochemical system that evolves in a population.
So how am I supposed to understand how RNA gets transcribed into a protein? without using those 4 words.
Oh, easy.
You want me to do it?
Anybody can do that really here.
Yeah, I can do
The
that.
RNA molecule associates with ribosome, and then there's an affinity between tRNA, anticodon.
Doesn't affinity mean that they must like each other?
No.
No.
Association is sort of a social
Dave,
action, right?
no.
Like,
It's not.
An affinity, no. Doesn't necessarily mean that.
Between
Okay,
the
well-
anticodon and the codon, which allows for increased affinity between the 2 bits of the ribosome, pushing the amino acids together and forming a new bond. And now you have a peptide chain extension.
And did you like the way that I try to convey that the information is causing these physiochemical changes and conformation changes from all the way from DNA to protein? Because it's kind of what it's doing. It's just changing things.
You guys understand
What
that lay
information?
people that are listening to you aren't absorbing
Yeah, so this thing,
what you're saying and being able, and if your goal is to all talk amongst yourselves in linguistic terms that you can understand amongst yourselves as people who understand these concepts and are familiar with them and enjoy talking about them on a high level, fantastic, great, be semantic. If you want to transmit it to the public in an understandable way, what just happened?
Shannon, in my presentation, I explained exactly how DNA goes to a protein, and I didn't use any of those 4 words. Very
You
simple.
may have done that. You may have done that. But how many people like me? I think a lot of the issue is if you're going to be a teacher, if you're going to be somebody who teaches people how to understand a concept, having these high level semantic conversations is not a way to teach people. It might be a way to increase your expertise, but it is not a way to teach. And when you already have a level of expertise, it's very, very easy to not be able to see that.
I agree with you.
like
Honestly,
when you
I would use pictures.
teach the alphabet, right?
Hang
You
on,
say,
hang
I'm
on.
all about pictures.
But the problem is you only have certain. Hang on. The only problem is you have a certain amount of time to put everything information is. If this was a course and you had a couple of days to go over what we did for like the central dogma biology, it would be a lot more easy, right? But I mean, I have to put, like in my presentation, I have 1 slide for transcription. That could take a year to understand.
How about just explaining how the code was cracked? In 1968, the Nobel Prize was won for cracking the genetic code.
You're so fixated on the language. Again,
That is a very specific thing that they did. They cracked a code that could have been the code could have been any set of symbols, and those symbols could have represented any set of amino acids. But there's a specific code that life uses.
I think you're reading way more into that, John. Honestly, I'm
John,
very sincerely.
Why can't you just say, I guess this is Nuremberg, right? Nuremberg et al. In the 60s determined the association between RNA molecules and polypeptides.
There you go.
Because then you miss out on the significance that you can.
Why is that not significant? Why is it not significant? Because I said.
Let me explain it to you.
Well,
You're missing out. Let me explain it to you.
Okay.
We have learned, so you can actually generate random genetic codes. So, we've got there's using 3 nucleotides. You can create random genetic codes. And we have found that the genetic code used by living organisms is extremely optimized for the weaknesses of the ribosome to compensate for those. It's extremely well optimized. There's that paper that I sent you about the genetic code being 1 in a million. People have researched this. People who are studying the origin of life want to know what were the limitations. Why was this being optimized? Just like the Morse code is optimized for the letter E, because that's a letter used most often. The genetic code is optimized. It's in triplets, because 3 allows to code for all the 20 amino acids, have some redundancies, plus have stop codons, plus have start codons. It allows for all of that. And knowing this means that knowing this gives us information. It tells us that early on in the origin of life, there must have been multiple codes that were in competition with each other, and this one won because it was most efficient.
Well, that's fine, John, but that's just evolution. You could say that. You could say that same description for any character state that we.
No one would have ever been able to figure out what I just told you if we weren't considering this a code. It was thinking of this as a code, understanding it as a code that is optimized, that told us that about the origin of life.
But we always think of traits that have evolved through natural selection as being optimal.
But that's how we usually.
It's not anything,
right?
Huh?
Like if you want to teach a kid the alphabet, right? You don't start off with, well, A is a symbol that was created by this culture and represent, like you don't go into all of that. Like you just, A is for apple. You create associations with concepts that can be then translated into skills over time.
And John,
right?
I don't disagree with you that the code metaphor wasn't useful in this sense.
It's not a metaphor. This
well, I know
the bulk of my argument.
It
is not a metaphor. It is literal.
I know that's what you think.
It is absolutely a metaphor.
Yeah, I agree.
I know that's what you think.
Well,
John.
all models in some ways are metaphors, right? So like it can both be a literal code in the sense that it is the representation that it is, and it can be a metaphor in the sense that that's the language we're using to describe and convey information.
Yeah, and
it is a code. It is a code in the exact same way that ASCII code is a code.
The
famous problem you can point out with his idea that it's a code, by the way. Like the problem you could point out is that it essentially reduces any natural process into a code.
Right.
Like you can make sense of a hurricane
thank you,
by connecting what's happening in a hurricane, like wind blowing around everywhere, with an abstract, like a set of symbols and stuff, with a code that we can make sense of. So you're reducing everything
because a hurricane is not a communication system.
You're reducing everything into nature into a code as well. So you're like evacuating any usefulness from your concept of DNA as a code.
Well, we talked
about everything. Let me explain this again. Let me explain. I don't know how many times I have to explain this. There is a communication system between the ribosome and the genome, and the genetic code describes the rules for that communication system. There is no communication system between a tornado. Like,
sure there is.
Sure there is.
Can you predictably and consistently
David, can you sit back for a second? Like the idea, the classic example is that when you have smoke, that means fire, right? You have a clear communication system. The smoke is communicating the existence of fire to us. But clearly, that's just some causal connection we could describe. There's like different chemicals happening when smoke's rising in the air, and then there's a fire combustion occurring. We could talk about that causally. But when we want to talk about this communication, we're appealing to abstract concepts, abstract symbols that we make sense of. You're not going to be able to. I'm sorry. I think that's all I really wanted to say. Actually.
Okay, so a coded system, the sender and the receiver have to agree in advance on what that is. Yes.
So the ribosome agrees with DNA molecule.
It has evolved to. Yes.
It evolved the ability to agree with other
agents. Agree. How can you have a ribosome which has no desires, beliefs, goals, anything, agree with a DNA molecule?
Okay, so it is set up in advance. I talked about this in my video, how these rules evolve. The rules have to be there in advance, and if you change the rules, the proteins that are produced will not function. If you change the rules of the communication system, the proteins will not function.
Rules are things that are relativized to an agent's aims, goals, or desires, their intentions, right? You could be in or out of accord
of the genetic code.
How are you out of accord with the genetic code if a mutation occurs, right?
The rules of the genetic code.
What happens is that evolution actually could take that and make it into an advantage. This is all just causal interactions between natural things. Whereas there's no rules being set by an agent of any kind.
The rules of the genetic code are set by the sequence of the tRNAs anticodon. That's what the rules are set in. Now that modern biology,
vast oversimplification.
now that biology depends on proteins in order to survive. Now that modern cells depend on proteins in order to survive, you can no longer tweak the rules of the genetic code and have the organism survive. They will die. So evolution has locked this communication system in. That's why there's hardly any difference between different organisms in the genetic code that they use. The rules are the same because there is a dependence on proteins in modern organisms.
But John,
early on,
that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not a code is a literal term or a metaphor. All you're saying is that evolution is based on contingency. So historical contingency is why all organisms have this genetic code, because it evolved very, very early. Those relationships evolved very early, and all life inherited those same biochemical relationships.
And
that doesn't have anything to do with whether a code is a proper metaphor or not.
And just a warning to people, I'm about to get way too technical here, but it's not about the anticodon. It's about the association between the anticodon and the rest of the tRNA, and the association between the shape of that tRNA with the specific amino acid transferases.
Before we get into that, can we read the super chat? Because I want to dive into that just for a second.
Sure. No, that was it. That was the whole thing.
Oh, okay. Because I had. Let me do the super chat real quick from Sarah. I hope I pronounced this right. Sarabia. Can I say it's a dichotomy when you compare living things to inanimate objects? Well, yeah, I think there's some differences there, but I think, Christopher, I think you're right. That's kind of one of the reasons I put that one slide in when dealing with charging of the codon, the anticodon with the tRNA, right? Because that enzyme, each one, it requires a special one to combine a specific amino acid with the tRNA, right? Each one of those enzymes has a special shape that only it'll fit to, correct?
Right. Yeah. So if you were to remove,
my voice is shot, by the way.
If you were to remove all of the tRNAs from a genome except for one, and then make a bunch of copies of it such that the anticodon, so that each one had a different anticodon, right? So now all possible codons have a matching anticodon, but all of the tRNAs associate with the exact same amino acid transferase. Well, now you're going to get, you're still going to produce protein, but it's always going to be a string of the same amino acid all the way down.
So it's going to be the same exact peptide string, right?
Yeah. But if you want to change the genetic code, you just find the specific tRNA that you want to change, and all you have to change is that it's codon, it's anticodon.
No, but if
you're going,
that's
to
all
change,
you do. But if that's all you do, then all you're doing there is you're going to change which codon that amino acid corresponds to. But it doesn't change what amino acid gets put onto it, right? And those are two different ends of the same thing.
The phenotype's the same still.
What it does is it changes the rules that govern the communication system, and that is the genetic code.
I mean, so what?
So we want to, when we're studying the origin of life, what we want to know is how did this system emerge and how did it solidify into the rules that we have today? When we're studying the origin of the genetic code, we're studying the origin of these rules.
But
you're studying biochemistry
without using all this intentional lingo associated with it, or use the lingo but be clear about the fact that these things aren't agents, they aren't intentional, they aren't, etc. You can still study that. It's not like the only way that you can study the origin of life is to use intentional language. I mean, that's my point. It's
okay. So are you saying that the word code is an intentional language?
I'm saying that it's like my example I gave before about the word flow. Flow is the same word used to describe different scientific or natural phenomenon, and those different phenomena are very different, even though we describe them the same way with the same term.
So can I give a perfect example for this? Because I did another debate on this very thing. When they talk about the difference between the proton gradient for ATP synthase, John, right? They talk about a flow of protons, right? because that's an ionized hydrogen ion. So you have a proton gradient there, but they call that a turbine sometimes. Sometimes you hear people talk about ATP synthase being a turbine. The problem with that linguistically is it doesn't carry over to mechanical engineering, because a turbine by definition converts flow, rotational energy by fluid flow to, mechanical, linear energy to mechanical energy. Okay, so you have a linear steam flow, and then you have a rotation that's produced. That's what a turbine does, but that's only for a fluid, right? And a proton flow is not fluid. So that is not a turbine in that analogy, but people still call it a turbine. But technically, that is not true.
Well, more to the point, a turbine works through basically the fluid is hitting part of the turbine.
Impact,
right? Yeah, and
it's
there's transfer of kinetic energy, and the kinetic energy is completely irrelevant.
Right.
So if we're talking about the flow of water, and we're talking about the flow of electricity, it would be fair to say that those are both types of flows, right?
No.
No.
I mean, we use the word flow to describe them both.
There's no flowing going on in a wire. There's nothing flowing. There's
they are very different processes.
There's different holes moving from
different type, right? I mean, the word is describing a different thing, but it's a type of flow.
No, it's
no.
Well, if you're talking about like AC, right? What's the flow there?
It's going back and forth. There's nothing
right,
flowing.
yeah, but you still talk about power flowing through the line if you're going to be right, but there's nothing flowing though. Right. It's just going back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, but when you're but when you add that information, aren't you just describing the parameters for that type of flow? The reason that we're using that word?
Yeah, then that's fine.
That's just an analogy.
So then, isn't it fair to say that DNA could be literally a type of code?
We use
type.
But by that logic, it could literally be a type of sandwich too.
It could be a green
cheese. You define sandwich in such a way that it applies to DNA.
Exactly.
I mean,
you're just defining it to be the case at that point. This is the difference between what I was talking about descriptive and prescriptive before as well.
Code is a convenient term that we use because we don't have a better one. And as long as we're clear about how we use the term code in translation and transcription and things like that, as opposed to how we use code in other contexts, then I think it's fine. So I have to go in a minute, but
I'm going to be ending this too. I mean, I think it's fine to call it a code for heuristic purposes. I think it's fine for undergraduate and and again, I'm only speaking as a layperson, but it goes to the same thing that Shannon was talking about. If we're communicating to a lay audience, then people use these types of terminology, but you're involving like 6 different huge fields in this very topic. You have chemistry, physics, cryptography, biology, information theory. All those in itself are just massive amounts of things, right?
What I'm saying is the genetic code is a code in exactly the way that Claude Shannon used the term in communication systems.
And I have to go in a minute, but there's a very famous quote by this statistician. You probably heard of it. His name is George Box. And he talked about models and statistics. And he has this great quote because I think it's applicable here. He says, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And I think that's the same thing here, is code in a lot of ways is useful, even when we talk about DNA, but that doesn't mean that it's the best sort of description that we can have, or it doesn't mean that it doesn't lend some confusion to the phenomenon. And I agree with Shannon too, that this is a very tough thing to talk about with the lay public. And this might seem kind of esoteric and stuff like that. So I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think we have to recognize that it is a hard thing to talk about, and it is a problem in science communication, and we have to figure out how to effectively communicate science, but also accurately communicate science. And those two things are very difficult to do at the same time. So
I agree, 1,000%.
Wouldn't that really come down to effectively teaching people to communicate, right? Like how communication works, and that certain things are going to mean things in other contexts. I mean, if you have an understanding of communication, you're better able to communicate concepts.
And nobody in science who's a professional scientist gets that kind of training. Almost no one.
I have that training.
Right.
If you're good at communication, then you can communicate concepts better.
In school, like
insightful.
But
well, that's why there needs to be collaboration with people like Shannon, who might have that kind of training in communication.
Well, that's the
myself,
thing, though.
who might know the science, and people like that need to get together and figure out more effective ways to, like I said, more accurately and effectively communicate the science, because sometimes those two things are in opposition to one another.
I agree, and I apologize for my frustration earlier, but that's where my frustration stems from, is because these are things that I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about making sure that things are communicated effectively. And
well, Shannon, you have no idea how frustrated I am, because I'm a teacher. So the stuff that the stuff that Steve was talking about just a minute ago about proton flow and driving ATP synthase, I just taught today. And I'm already thinking, as he's saying it, I'm already thinking about how I'm going to say that in the future lectures and what I'm going to say. So I'm always thinking about that. So
I understand that that's a hurdle for, especially for you, because you have an expertise. And when you have an expertise, like I mentioned earlier, you don't realize the things that you know and almost innately at this point that you think go without saying, that need to be communicated in a message in order for somebody else to understand the things that you understand. And that's what's really complex about being a teacher. And a science communicator is essentially a teacher. So when you go into these really high level semantic arguments, my fear is, and my frustration is, that the teaching opportunity is lost in the minutia of that debate.
Yeah.
And people that really need the information, that everybody's arguing about how best to transmit the information, and nobody's transmitting it effectively. People are just arguing about how to do it. People are just arguing about how it's done badly, but nobody's proposing how can it be done better.
Shannon,
that is what frustrates me.
Can I interject?
Absolutely, Steve. I'm sorry.
Yeah. If I was going to present this as a layperson to explain the whole process, I would have gone a completely different route. The point tonight was talk about a code, not how the central dogma of biology works. We just kind of touched on those. If I want, and I have done a presentation, I have actually protein the whole process in PDF that I've done a long time ago. That was a lot different approach. That would have been from more a pedagogical type approach, where I want to explain to somebody conceptual things, because as a layperson, as a science communication person, I have an extra onus to make sure that what I put out is correct. I go to the experts, right? Because I don't have that expertise. I only have my ability to read something, try to understand it, and try to communicate that other people can understand. And hopefully I get it right. And if not, I'm called out on it. People will say, Steve, you're wrong. CRISPR and I had this conversation literally a couple of days ago, and he pointed out some mistakes in my presentation. I corrected them because I was like, you're right? Because I had thought about it, and I was like, okay, you know what? I can't argue about it because he's being factually correct. So my presentation was not designed to explain to somebody how this all works, except on a very, very superficial level.
Sure. Yeah, and yeah. I would say all this is, to Shannon and John, this is, and to Steve too, if you're a science communicator, this is a hard thing to do. This is not easy. So if you're finding easy answers to things of how you do this, you're probably missing something, because
it's hard as hell. And especially so many subjects we deal with. This is only one top. Look how many subjects we deal with all the time. I mean, look at poor Shannon. She has to go through pages and pages of stuff all the time. That's completely different from her area of expertise.
I just finished.
It can't be easy.
I got a teaching fellowship here at Marshall, where I finished a year-long fellowship, and part of that fellowship, I had to run a seminar that was only about teaching past students' intuitions. So it was about how you deal with intuitions that people come into the classroom with about a subject, and how you teach them that when they're not a blank slate. So, and it was all about this sort of stuff about how students come into the classroom with their own misconceptions, and how you don't want to reinforce those misconceptions, but work around them to bring them to, the real understanding of the phenomenon that you're trying to teach. And it's incredibly difficult. So, this stuff,
I guess I'm closer in my approach to things to what Shannon is, kind of her background, and talking communications and how people think and that sort of thing. And when I hear a good science communicator, and I'm measuring not this based on whether they're right or wrong, but whether or not I'm able to understand what the hell they're talking about, right? If you're coming into a new concept that requires all this underlying knowledge, it's far easier to learn that concept if it is described to you in a way that it can make sense in a vacuum that you can relate to, right? Like to assume that just because you're talking to an adult means that they have a sufficient understanding to know all the terms and things that are being used, rather than just saying, okay, how do I convey the concept of the model that I'm trying to teach? We can worry about terminology after the fact and assign that, but just communicating what the model is, and also being able to communicate the sorts of misconceptions and what they might be thought of as within a model. Like, worry about the terminology later, because if you box yourself into using only special words and not these words and not those words, you're hamstringing your ability to communicate concepts, I think.
I'm not fully sure I agree with that. I think that it's,
Yeah,
I think
me either.
to establish things early on, Dave, to be honest with you. But let me read two chats real quick, then you guys say what you want, and then we're going to call this our close. The Athens 619, he does the same as Ken Hovind. He doesn't know what a kind is. And then the last super chat, so nobody does. Nobody does, really. Sarah Bia, doesn't pathology of biology describe connections of, quote, lock and key for a specification and symbiosis, i.e. amylase, to carbs, pepsids with proteins, synapses with neurons, etc., to justify a code? That would be a cipher. Lock and key is a cipher.
Oh, synapses with neurons.
Yeah, the problem is when you talk about lock and key,
for me.
the lock and key, with the aminoactyl transferase, that's a lock and key mechanism. That's a cipher, in my opinion.
Okay, synapses with neurons. No, though, because there's a synaptic gap and there's neurotransmitters that are emitted and that are received by the receptor.
And let me ask you this, Shannon. Like, for example,
they don't fit together. There's a neurotransmitter that's emitted essentially by the synapse into the synaptic gap.
Though, that's chemical communication.
But yeah, it is.
If you have a system where you have, and then we're going to call it a close. If you have two computers and you have a signal going through it, and you have a key that's being encrypting that into something, right? And then downstream you have a decryption key. People still call that a code, but again, he's calling this a lock and key in the chat, in the super chat. That is an encryption process, not an encoding process. Because you have to have the key, and keys deal with ciphers, not codes. But anyways, I'm gonna leave it up to you guys. John, do you want the last word, or do you want to say your piece now, and then we'll let everybody else go?
Well, I think yeah, I mean, I still think that the genetic code is extremely significant. It needs to be studied. It needs to be understood. Its origin needs to be understood. I mean, this is an important thing to study. And if we stop calling it a code, stop recognizing it, we lose that. And I think that's a huge waste.
Okay.
It's a very specific set of rules for a communication system that really does exist in your cells. To ignore that is to ignore something extremely fascinating.
Well, I would just like to say that not recognizing that it's not a code in the sense that other things are codes, or even saying that it's not necessarily a literal code at all, or saying that a code is just a metaphor for what it is, none of that will stop people from studying molecular biology or origin of life. It's not like if they say, some researcher who studied this for 20 years is going to say, oh, it's not a literal code. Well, I guess I'm going to quit doing what I'm doing. I mean, if you're worried about people not studying this anymore, just because you clarify the term, that's not going to happen. People will still study it regardless of whether it's a literal code or a figurative code, or you have to qualify what it is as a code. That'll keep going on. So it's not going to change any of that if that's what you're worried about.
Oh, yeah, this paper, like the genetic code is 1 in a million. You can look at that up.
Well, so what?
What they had to do with this is they had to see it as a code, and understanding that codes can have arbitrary symbols. They had to invent a bunch of alternative genetic codes, test them against the actual genetic code that we find in life to find what it's optimized to do.
But so
and
what?
if we didn't have this concept of a code, this research would be impossible.
No,
Without the concept of a code,
I-
it would.
They'll do it. They could still do it.
No. Read this paper. It would not be possible. They would not have the mental tools to even.
Sure you
think
would.
about these
It's
things.
called a heuristic. The code in this case is a heuristic tool to describe the
Exactly.
biological phenomenon. And if you just recognize it as a heuristic tool, in this case, it's still there. It doesn't have to be a literal code to write that paper.
And that's why I specifically said in my second thing that I'm taking a heuristic approach for the same reasoning, because I think that is a very good thing to use as heuristics to try to get people to understand something. But that's all it is when you're using with code. It doesn't. If you got rid of it, it wouldn't change anything.
Just like George Box said,
It absolutely would change things. You can't think of this without the concept. You need the concept in order to think about it.
That's fine. But like George Box said, all models are wrong and some are useful. And in this case, the code concept is a model that is useful, even though it might not be literally right in every respect.
I would say it has more utility over being technically perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and
I would say the only difference is that it was not invented by a entity; it evolved. And so when we talk about the genetic code, the thing that I've gotten tonight is, if we talk about the genetic code, we need to make sure we're talking about it. We make it clear that it is an evolved code.
Well, that's
an
important.
Created code.
That's if we've achieved nothing tonight, that is a good one. So,
but I actually already knew that, and it was in my slides. It was.
Well, I get it, but that's I think that's the main clarity that needs to be made. So.
We'll go with that. So, anyways, thanks a lot, guys. Shannon, by the way, I didn't get a chance to thank you for moderating earlier. Thank you very much. You did a wonderful job. If I have any other debates, I want you to moderate them if that's okay. But I don't have them that often, and I really think that I wish to. But it was only a handful of topics I felt comfortable enough discussing, right? And nobody wants to take me on about polonium halos.
Because nobody wants to listen to you talk about polonium halos.
Because they know I'll kick their ass. It's like the one subject I really can dive into a lot. Anyways, good night, guys. Thank you for the super chats. Thank you for voting. Go vote on the Twitter. I'll put it out there one last time in the live chat, and we'll call it a night. Good night, guys.
Good night.